So this is a very fluid conversation, and there's no pre-established agenda. We're just going to kind of ask questions, or I'm going to ask questions and let kind of things go where they want to go. To frame the conversation, the premise of the conference is secularism is over. I made a case for that that's pretty esoteric, probably, from your perspective. But in the world of the academy, it would have been sort of taken as pretty kind of pointed, and I think it would have been something, or would be something that people would think more or less is sacrosanct. In other words, it's done. By the way, essentially in academic circles, what I described for you is pretty much accepted broadly. So you got a little window into things. And it's been the case for the last 20 years or so that people have been talking about the post-secular society. I think the thing that might have surprised you is the fact that, or my guess is that you probably had a preacher that would rail against secularism all the time. What secularism, as I described it, is invisible Christianity. The idea being that what the secular leadership wanted, or the people behind secularism, or promoted it, or celebrated it, is they wanted the values of Christianity without the doctrines. That's what they wanted, because they believed that the doctrines would be divisive. Does that sound familiar? You probably have pastors who think that way. So doctrine is divisive, but the values are things we can all celebrate. Anybody here familiar with Thomas Jefferson's Bible? Okay, you can go to the Smithsonian Institution and actually see the Bible. It's very thin because he cut out all the things that are miraculous. Anything that would relate to the divinity of Christ, the divinity of the Spirit, that kind of stuff. He wanted the morality of Christianity without the doctrine. And that's pretty much what secularism also assumed to be kind of the ideal. But that's over. And that point that I was just simply making is that's over. And what we need now is a very honest and forthright proclamation of doctrine, providing the basis for the Christian life. And it ought to leaven our society. It ought to be something that influences politics, business, etc. Anyway, so that was what I was up to. Now, with the conference, Aaron, who's an old friend, is here to talk about why we need a new kind of leader who's actually an old kind of leader. That's kind of, I think, what you were making the case for when you were talking about the WASP establishment. And we have a leadership dearth, and we need leaders to fill the void. So there's a meaning void, but there's also a leadership void. Tomorrow, Andrew Walker will be here to talk to us about, sort of the rest of the story in terms of, what are the doctrines, the teachings that our society needs to be reintroduced to. So the idea is that I described why there's a void, and Aaron and Andrew are going to fill the void. Anyways, I'm joined here tonight by, obviously, Aaron, but also some guys that are friends of mine, Nate Fischer and Timon Cline with American Reformer, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So why don't we start with you, Nate?
Great to be here, and thanks, Chris. I'm a co-founder of American Reformer, really heavily inspired by Aaron's work that really shaped a lot of how I thought about both the sort of limitations in the church and also the opportunities of the moment. I saw him speaking to things. I would say I took a venture mindset, and really my primary job is running New Founding, which is a venture firm where essentially I look for outsized opportunities for impact and in the business space for profit. I looked at Aaron's.
So you're a businessman, Nate.
Yes.
Okay, I just want to make that clear for everybody.
Yes.
And you're an investor.
I'm an investor. So My day job is I run New Founding, which I started in January of 2021 as essentially a bet on the intersection of the political right and the venture and technology world. It was not a popular time to be publicly on the political right. And I saw those as converging. I saw those as the convergence of those is critical to the future of the right. Now, alongside that, my sense was if we're in a sense building the institutions that are going to shape the future, that are going to define aspirations, they need to be anchored by a Christian vision. And my sense was the evangelicalism of the day, the legacy evangelical institutions lacked. They didn't know how to speak to those questions and to really anchor those aspirations to a positive Christian vision. And American Reformer was started to help fill that gap. So there was an element to which American Reformer was critiquing the legacy evangelicalism, but more importantly, it was designed to actually be the center of discussion that would define what we should aspire to positively.
So when you say legacy evangelicalism, am I right in thinking of, say, sort of the status quo when it comes to, say, megachurch Christianity and like big names, or are you thinking about it in even a more broad way?
So I was thinking more, what's interesting about megachurch Christianity is I think, and Aaron could speak to this, I think they actually in some sense are more receptive to market forces. So they sort of go with where the flow is more. I'm thinking more of the Gospel Coalition, the sort of evangelical elite institutions. I call them elite adjacent evangelicals because I don't think they're really a sort of meaningful part of America's elite today, but they tend to be sort of adjacent to those circles. And I went to Calvin College, which I would say is a sort of Christian-ish college, and really epitomized a lot of what I think is really terrible about that sector. But really, I would say the sort of thought leaders, right, the Keller world, the thought leaders in evangelicalism weren't talking about the questions that mattered.
So let me just kind of help people understand where you're coming from. Am I right in remembering you were homeschooled?
Yes. So I could get into a little personal background. So I was homeschooled in upstate New York in the 90s. It was not a normal it was not a commonplace thing at the time.
I remember those days.
Yes. I grew up there, went to Calvin, went to Harvard Law School, was a little later in Cambridge than
I was there in the seedy days. You were there in the nice gentrified days.
It was much more gentrified, and then went straight into business. Was straight into buying distressed apartment buildings in Florida. Moved down to Tampa, and essentially made the first of what I see as sort of my career focus on macro bets. What are major opportunities? I bought a bunch of apartment buildings in the wake of the financial crisis. Did that for about 5 years. That trade matured, and I started thinking about what was next. Meanwhile, got married, wife, 5 kids. We live in Dallas now.
Yeah. And your wife's Harvard educated as well. I met her just the other day.
She has 3 degrees from Harvard, so I only have 1. She made a better decision for college than I did.
That's right. All right. So Timon, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm the editor-in-chief at American Reformer, so I run the journal, and I'm a lawyer. It's like being a Marine. You're always a lawyer. People always say I'm a recovering lawyer. This is not a thing. You're always a lawyer, for good or ill. But I was a lawyer before that. I was in government practice, and but also went to seminary and was doing at a certain point it was like moonlighting, writing in the evenings. This was an unsustainable schedule to have like.
So you were doing law and seminary.
Yeah, I did my law degree in seminary at the same time, and then I went into practice, but I was still, writing in the evenings, and this again was just totally unsustainable. And much of it started going to, the 2021 was when American Reformer was founded. So American Reformer had already, marked itself out as like this is the only place that's receptive to certain kinds of ideas, certain ways of talking about politics and social life and culture, especially in antiquated ways, right? So if you're at all sort of intrigued by or interested in the Protestant tradition and older ways of life, then this is not received well by legacy institutions. They're not interested. So this is a natural home for it. So I was already writing, and then at a certain point I realized I was extremely bored practicing law, and that's when I went to join American Reformer and do some other things as well.
So if I remember right, you were in New Jersey.
I was in New Jersey. Yes.
Yeah, we feel bad for you, but
Yeah, I was in Newark.
oh, you even feel worse.
I had to appear in court in Newark a lot, and I was there when they filmed part of a season of The Walking Dead in Newark, and it was like everyone was pumped about this, and it was like, you know, they were scouting locations, and they're like, Newark's perfect, change nothing about Newark, it's ready for anyway.
Anyways, if you were from the East, you'd know what he's talking about. But anyway, but you were also in government, if I remember right, some kind of government
Yeah,
role.
I was a deputy AG in New Jersey.
Deputy Attorney General.
Yes.
For the state of New Jersey.
Yes.
Okay, you had a lot of work, I'm sure.
Yes.
Anyway, so those are all important things to know in terms of understanding, you know, your perspective, where you're coming from. Now, when you say legacy Protestantism, I think many people think like Protestantism is something that doesn't have a legacy, it doesn't have a history, doesn't have any kind of intellectual depth or anything like that. It's all about what's happening now, you know. But you're of a different opinion.
Yes, I'm of a different opinion. Yeah, I mean, something happened. This is one explanation for what's kind of happened now, especially with, you know, younger guys, we'll just say. Probably 20-something years ago in the academy, you know, Christian academy, there was enthusiasm and interest in recovering Protestant sources, the, you know, confessional type sources, things that undergird your doctrine, and this cooked along for a while in the academy, and sort of you can look back and see, okay, we're at this stage, we're recovering, we're talking about this doctrine. People are recovering sources from the 16th and 17th century about XYZ doctrine, and that would be exciting for a while. You'd have like 200 dissertations written that year on that doctrine, you know, because everyone's excited, and eventually you're going to get to, you know, texts about political life. You're going to get to text about things that are secular, that are worldly, which do exist. It was just a matter of time before people found them again. And there's sort of oceans of ink spilled on this stuff, maybe more than other doctrines, if you pick discrete doctrines. And so it was just this sort of realization that was a natural progression of, I think, scholarship in many ways. But a lot of the legacy institutions were like, we're not going there. This is too far.
Yeah,
because the implications
why would they
are
say it was too far?
Yes.
Were they afraid of the implications of it?
Yeah, the implications are really bad.
From their perspective, or just bad?
No, they're great. They're just bad. Yeah.
So in other words, knowing what, say, like the Reformers thought about the role of the church in a civil state or a civil environment was like something that was important to them, but not to us.
Right. I mean, these things, obviously, they're in some sense pre-modern or early modern, are going to conflict with modernity. Right. So, and they're going to conflict with especially liberal modernity, right? So anytime, I mean, this is some of what Aaron was talking about at the end of his talk, is, you know, things that cut against the grain or against the status quo are not going to be received in our current environment warmly, right? They're destabilizing, and that's a natural impulse, but they're destabilizing, and you know, a lot of people had, I won't name names now, but probably eventually, a lot of people had sort of staked out a career in what I refer to as like baptizing the status quo in Christian doctrine and lingo, right? Which is great. And so you're sort of in the same stream, but down the stream of the broader establishment, right? This is a very comfortable position. You get recognition, and you get you're seeking your status from without.
So
right?
let me just sort of try to comb this out a bit. So let's say Black Lives Matters is all the rage, so consequently megachurch pastors want to be on the bandwagon?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't even thinking of it, you know, that far. Let's just say your assumption that a liberal democracy is the proper mode of government, and especially for like all time. This is the pinnacle of like a political and civil way of life. That
so we're at the end of
would
history
be,
now, and so everything else before this was a mistake.
Yeah, you have to have a very, in its own way, kind of providentialist view, but you have to, you know, you're always sort of, so you saw all these books like over the past decade that's like an analysis of John Calvin's political thought. And it's like, oh, what's the conclusion going to be? He gave us all the tools we needed to be a good democracy, right? Just amazing. If you look at anything about Geneva, it's a curious conclusion. But that was kind of the mode of scholarship when you were going to touch things that pertain to social and political life. You're going to massage them out or excuse the things that are incongruent with the present, or simply ignore it and dismiss it altogether, right? And so that's what's now being confronted. And this is some of, at American Reformer, we're eager to host and facilitate discussions that reconsider these things, but not from a position or view from nowhere, but from the Protestant tradition, because we think there's great resources there. Not everything is sort of woodenly applicable, but it at least allows you to, if nothing else, analyze critically the present.
Great. Well, I want to get to Aaron and your talk. You make a case for an elite, which you noted in your talk is almost like a four-letter word today. So I think that many of us, because we've been so disappointed by elites, quote, that we don't have much maybe willingness to consider the value of elites, but you make a case for the WASPs. And I knew some of those people, and the things you described actually brought back memories. So let me give you an example. So my wife's great uncle was a Brahmin, Boston Brahmin, or New England Brahmin. Brahmin was the term that was used in New England for the elites or the WASPs. And I remember we were at an event. She can probably remember this as just as vividly as I do. We were on the plaza in Kansas City, and Uncle Ralph Earl, that's an old New England name, he was in his 80s, and he refused to sit down if a woman didn't have a seat. So he's 80 years old, in a suit, standing, and everybody's begging him to sit. But he refuses because his sense of what's the proper thing to do as a gentleman wouldn't permit it. Now, he was a wonderful guy. He had his quirks, but that, I think, is what comes to my mind when I think about the old WASPs. So let's get into this a little bit. What would a new elite, and I don't want to steal your thunder from tomorrow, but do we have any hope for something like that again? Or do you have any hope for something like that again?
Yeah, putting my thoughts about the WASPs in the context of your talk, it makes me think that they were sort of the embodiment of the secular city ideal. They were liberal Protestants, but they were still very much Christian in that sense, and they wanted this humanistic form of government. And of course, that, as you say, that's no longer there. And so the question is, what comes next? And it's, I think it's not obvious what to do, because, and this is one of the things that this is a situation I think we face in America in quite a number of domains, is once you lose organic continuity with a tradition, it is impossible to restore it. And so, trying to think of a good example of this, but a lot of people today will say that they want to be Anglicans. I want to become an Anglican. Okay, that's great. But I see many of these people who are in these Anglican church in North America churches. 100% of them were not raised Anglican. They're people who were converts to Anglicanism, and they even most of the Anglican priests I know were not even raised in that tradition. And so there is an element, there is a sort of embodied element to culture. You couldn't take the U.S. Constitution and our legal system and just give it to some other group of people and expect to get the United States. And so
didn't we try that in Iraq?
Yeah, exactly.
Liberia.
And so there is the sense in which there's no more organic continuity with sort of the WASPs. They're gone. There's no more organic continuity with much of mainline Protestantism. Very, very difficult to understand how you would think about that. Much of what we're trying to recreate, the Latin Mass is a modern movement in a sense in the Catholic Church. And so I think we are, we're a little bit like Aeneas fleeing from the ruins of Troy. we're in a sort of a refounding situation. I think that's why I like the term new founding. In a sense, we have to create something new. And I think ultimately, there's no. I think it's very hard to to say, well, we'll intentionally construct some set of institutions and vehicles. But I think as we get through this, we'll have to, think about we have to create new things, because fundamentally we can't. I don't think there's enough left of the threads of the old to try to put the band back together in most cases. Now, that may be not true. I think there are institutions that have, like the Catholic Church, I think by and large, there's a lot of cradle Catholics. There's a real living tradition there. But I think we're, in a lot of places, we're sort of out to sea.
And the cradle Catholics are dropping like flies.
I think some of it is something is weird, like, with the cult, obviously the 60s were a big moment, and there's big cultural eruptions, and the boomers, you're a boomer, and like everybody likes to bash boomers today, but there was something weird. Like I think about this, I'm from Catholic peasant stock on both sides of my family, but my mother got involved in the Catholic charismatic renewal movement in the 70s, and left and became, I was raised in an Assemblies of God church, basically. So I was baptized Catholic, but I never even made it to First Communion. And I just, was recent, within the last year, just thinking, my mother's family was Catholic for over 1,000 years, and she just walked away from it. And we do that in America all the time. This great Twitter account, Empty America, who said the average American lives in a year zero situation in which they have no roots in anything that extend back prior to 1990. And that is really a problem, but I guess it's the opportunity, you might say.
Yeah, well, I can relate to a number of things that you noted there. But when we think about this idea of starting again, a new founding, right? One thing to draw some encouragement from is the reality of the early church, where they didn't have any institutions initially, but then they built the things that they needed to build in order to, in 400 years, become the success that they became. In other words, there's now obviously there's it's a mixed story, but it's always a mixed story. I think that the quest for an absolutely pure and unfaulty moment in the history of the church is a quixotic quest. There's always going to be, you go to Acts and there are people lying and dropping dead because they've been judged by God, like right on the spot. So it's like there was sin there. So we can't pursue perfection with any kind of realism. But what can we do now to maybe establish the foundations for a world that we can hand on to our kids or grandkids and so forth? So New Founding is doing some interesting things, and the name New Founding is great. American Reformer is drawing on the riches of the past. But do you guys have any thoughts on kind of where to start? Or maybe we could say we've already started and we're trying to continue.
So we're focused on technology, partially because I believe that technology is going to, and the digital layer of life is going to continue to rise in relative importance, both as a layer of sort of something that mediates a lot of our life, but really de facto as a layer of government. And it's a layer that remains in many ways up for grabs. So it's a layer where we are not dependent on established permission structures. You think of Elon Musk, and he gets control of Twitter, which is effectively capturing a government in the digital layer of life.
So let's just define what you mean by like a a regulatory, like if you are you
Yeah.
thinking like colleges and like the credentialing institutions, in that we can go outside that system?
It's less dependent, right? I mean, those things might play a role, but if you had to work your way up in legacy institutions, you often have lots and lots of gatekeepers who are going to limit your power. Whereas tech, so there's a line that Taleb has that I thought was good, which is to be a philosopher king, first be a king. And I think a lot of people want to be philosopher kings, and they start by trying to be a philosopher, and doesn't usually.
I've noticed that philosophers generally don't kind of go into the king phase ever.
No. So I think the key is power, and I would look at sort of the decline. I'll mention sort of the decline of the WASPs a little bit. You mentioned your wife's great uncle, and it sounds like he was sort of a great gentleman. I wonder if he still had a sort of strong confidence in his right to rule. And I look at a lot of people in that generation, and they maintain this sort of self-sacrificial side of that, but they lost. And you even think of the sort of the move to secularism, where you move away from this assumption that sort of the Protestant heritage is something that should be a gate actually to keep people out. You think of the families that realize that their family actually had a heritage, that the legacy status is morally good for you to actually have a sort of
They would work really hard to make sure that they married well.
Yes, and they gave that up, and so they maintained sort of the sacrificial side, and then you combine that, I think, with the sort of inflation of the 80s, and their bond portfolios were diminished relative to sort of new wealth, and so they lost their power, and they lost their self-confidence to the will to rule. I think what you now have is you have a class of people who have a lot of power, often in technology, but they don't have quite the same self-confidence in their right to rule. I think to get a new elite, what you will have is you will have a group of people who have power, know how to accumulate power, and also have a moral narrative that justifies the goodness of their rule. And that, I think, is something that I think is a path you've seen from it sort of many times throughout history. Sometimes it would be sort of warlords turned into aristocrats. It often involved the church playing a prominent role. And so I look at technology in some sense as the domain where new people can. I'm with Aaron. You're not going to just go back. It's once they've abdicated, it's not only have they abdicated, but they also have actually lost the money that even would have been a basis of that. So now you go to the domain where power can be accumulated, and then you, in some sense, you catechize the people who are in that domain, or you bring people into that domain and sort of channel capable people, capable Christians into that domain with a message that says more than just you're sort of a marketplace actor, and this is something that's supposed to stay out of politics too. You are, you do have a vision that is good, it's political, and you should pursue it with a vigor of the recognition that you're a steward of you're a steward of Christendom, right? I think that American Christians, America in some sense is the sort of torchbearer of Western civilization, of Christendom. The internet in many ways is a very, very American creation. It's natural that Americans will continue to shape and dominate it, given even the nature of the medium. And Christians remain in some sense the truest stewards of that civilization. So I think if we can recover our understanding of that right to rule, and really, probably it'll be a select group of people who have the capability to combine those. That, to me, is how we restore a new elite here.
So this confidence that you have a right to rule, I think that strikes many people because of our kind of an emphasis on equality is a very uncomfortable thing to accept. I accept it, but I think for a lot of folks, they're like, I don't like the sound of that. But you brought out, Aaron, the role of bankers, local bankers, and how they were invested in their community. So here's an example of how that worked in my own life. So I've been involved with commercial real estate since the early 90s, and I remember when I was going for a pretty significant investment, I had to go to the senior vice president of the commercial lending at Savings Bank of Manchester, which was a local bank. I mean, Manchester, right? Right. So I got to actually get to know this high-level person in this local bank who had the power to make the call. In other words, he didn't have to call somebody else to get permission. He wasn't relying on rubrics or it's just charts or any of that kind of stuff. In fact, he spent a lot of time just talking to me. getting to know me, wanted to know what I was about, and then made the call, and I got the loan. That is just not out there anymore. But it implies that you need to have a commitment to a local area, and you almost have to earn your position, and you have to develop the competence to do that sort of thing in that place. So what about, bringing together this confidence that you can make important decisions that affect lots of people, and competence? How do we revive that? Now, we're not probably going to see local banking make a comeback anytime soon.
Right. We actually do have more local banks than a lot of other countries, but typically, they are like small banks in small towns and things like that. I'd say it's not easy. And again, the entire structures, I'm thinking about your banker story, everything today is designed to make it essentially impossible, if not illegal, to do that. Because if you're making these personal determinations, then you might be discriminating against someone. Whereas if you just make arbitrary cutoffs on credit scores, or certain very objective metrics, and then tweak the metrics to get the desired ratio of all the different protected classes, then you're there. So our entire society has really been forcing people to strip out personal judgment, personal relationship, personal control in favor of essentially bureaucratic control, managerial control. And it's very difficult to go against that. Again, you'll find yourself sued, all these different things. It's a very kind of complex thing. I would say there's a couple things. One, I think the theology, Digby Baltzell's best book, and it's still a wonderful read. It's a little substantive, let's say. It's not like a light novel or something. It's called Puritan Boston and Quaker Philadelphia. And the thing about and he goes on about the Calvinistic beliefs of the Puritans. And one of the things that's clear when we talk about predestination and election today, in a Calvinistic sense, it is entirely about election to eternity. And for them, there was an element of election to eternity, but it was also, they viewed themselves as elected to the position of rulership in society. And they essentially had God's imprimatur to allow them to run the show, which of course they then had a responsibility, like the Protestant work ethic from Weber, because they have to, they can't be quite sure of their election and other things. They have to work extra super hard to do a good job to demonstrate that, that they were truly elect. And so this idea of developing competence, things of that nature. We also have a huge competence issue, as you noticed. And so I do think, and tomorrow I'm going to talk more about, I think, the theology of that. But I would certainly say from an evangelical perspective, it is essentially considered illegitimate to be in charge of anything, like in a substantive sense. And that is, so we have that issue. And then frankly, the competence issue is also a big issue, but it's not just an evangelical issue, it's throughout our society. It's just not very competent. That's why, doors are blowing out of planes and things like that.
So I've been thinking about this in this way. I've contrasted the ways people think about social change as being a choice between the revolutionary who runs into the streets and holds up signs and shouts at people, and the benefactor who's built a local business or built a significant church in the community, who's able to pick up the phone and get somebody on the line from City Hall and say, you know what, I think we ought to do this, or we should not do that, and actually is heard and affects change, has agency. I think we need more of the second and less of the former. In other words, the only way we're going to see long-term change is by building institutions that people believe are beneficiary to a community. And the way you do that is by being competent, by being morally upright, and having a sense of, I really do have some say around here. So now going to the theology of all that, when we think about these things, Timon, where would you point people in terms of the resources? I mean, you've got a much more capacious knowledge of the resources when it comes to the civic dimensions of our Protestant heritage than I do. What would be some, maybe resources that you point people, check this out, check that out?
Well, if I can say something about briefly about, I agree with Aaron and Nate that there's no going back, right? You can't go back, but you can't go back, but you can LARP, right. And you should LARP very hard.
Live action role
yes,
play,
sorry.
in case you're wondering what LARP means.
This is the most American thing in the world to do, but you have to LARP in the right way, right? And so to LARP well, you have to have the knowledge, but you also have to be sensitive to your own time, right? And so there's Carl Richards, a great historian of the American founding, says that the founders knew far more about ancient Rome than they knew about Europe. This is what they read, right? And their mind is totally in Rome, right? This is how they think about things happening. This is how they think about themselves. They give each other like their character names, right? There's plays put on all these things. So in a certain sense, they're living in an alternative, older universe. This is kind of a practice started by the Renaissance. It's like this big, long LARP, right? At the same time, there's many, various adjustments and changes that are rightly categorized as modern, as like new that they make to their. So the point is that they actually learn how to think like, from their perspective, the Romans did about the things they're encountering, right? And then they produce something new, right? So this is how it has to be approached. I think that's how we have to approach it as Protestants, with our own resources as well. But you have to. This is key. You have to LARP in the right way, and you should be LARPing very hard. Otherwise, I think in a sense you lack a certain resistance, and you are just swept up without an alternative vision, positive moral vision for the future. In terms of the resources in this way, again, these are not. I'm not theonomic about historical sources, right? You can't just plop these things down. But a great place to start that's very accessible for everyone is to actually read all your confessions, right? That you say you subscribe to. You should actually read these things and read how Scripture is used in them, and so on and so forth. And they will begin to poke at certain assumptions that you have. And then you should go read, great thing, a very accessible one you can all find that I've mentioned to everyone is you should read Johannes Althusius's Politica, right? In fact, he doesn't give you actually a perfect model, but he considers questions about political life and social life and even economic life in the way that a Protestant should, and then you're able to sort of go forth and use this in the even considers what do you do in a pluralistic society, right? The ceiling on his pluralism is way down here. Ours is up here. His pluralism is what if you have different kinds of Protestants and maybe some Catholics.
So, Baptists and Presbyterians, can they get along?
Yeah. And you're in the Holy Roman Empire also. But anyway, but these things are useful because they have no modern assumptions in them, right? But they are also in their own day confronting rapid and volatile change, which is similar to our own time, right? You can't imagine the volatile change of the 16th and 17th century, right? We've not even encroached it to your entire worldview, your plausibility structures. So it's very useful then to see how people think about volatile and disruptive times, because I think that is what we're entering and what we have to be prepared for. And there's not a lot of contemporary things that are written on the assumption of the thing that is now breaking down that are going to help you.
Right. Yeah, I think that we have the dual challenge of building in a environment where there's going to be a lot of conflict. So that was one of the things I was trying to get across with my talk, is that often when people hear, well, secularism is over, they assume, well, Christianity is back. Not so. Secularism is gone. The last vestiges of the old Christianity went with it, and now it's the void. And it's going to be us against a lot of other competing outlooks or schools of thought or religions or whatever. And we have to be able to deal with that, but at the same time build tomorrow. So how are we doing on time, James? Are we about wrapped up? 10 more minutes? So American Reformer is a publication. So how can people find it, and what should they expect when they get on the website, Timon?
What should they? Well, they can find it at AmericanReformer.org. So that's very easy. What should they expect? I hope what they can expect is, one, we realized, and I think Nate's already alluded to this, and Aaron's talked about it many times. There was not one thing about gaining sort of cultural confidence or confidence for yourselves, especially intellectually, is to have a place that is, we need a Protestant chauvinism in where we're writing. Because everywhere else that's available to sort of conservative Christians that may have lots of things you agree with, most of it is Catholic coded. That's just the way it is. They've excelled in many ways that we can learn from institutionally. So to have so it's a Protestant place, right? These are going to be Protestants writing about Protestant perspectives on things for the most part. And you can expect to find an array of sort of approaches to even the same topics and problems, right? And also a multiplicity of topics. So I talk a lot about political theory and these things. This is not all we do. There's other challenges and problems that have to be and can be addressed from various perspectives and with different tools, right? So more than just sort of the fundamentals of politics and how you think about this, or even society and its purpose, right? Like why should Christians be confident they should govern society? You have to think society's for a certain thing, and it's supposed to do a certain thing to people. If you don't think that society, generally speaking, is to the glory of God and is supposed to produce particular types of citizens and all these things, why are you better to rule it than anyone else, right? So you have to adapt this sort of presumption that is very traditional for us. But then there's other things that are emerging, such as the uses and development of technology that's already been touched on that we engage in as well, right? And this is sort of, it's not disconnected from your political thought or your theology, but it raises, in many ways, some novel questions for us, given the rapidity of the development and the applications and so on and so forth.
So both you, Timon, and Nate have talked about technology and politics, and these are often unaddressed subjects in most churches. Pastors will focus on, and I'm a pastor, things that are kind of immediate felt needs that people have, things related to family life, things related obviously to personal salvation. That's all important. But what I'm hearing you say is we need to make some room for some big things. Think about society, think about economics and stuff like that. Are there any things that maybe you want to say as we wrap up, Nate, to kind of put in our minds, maybe plant some seeds that maybe we can ruminate on between now and the end of the conference?
So I'll touch a little bit on those topics. I think in many ways, the church's retreat to, you say, things that are immediately applicable and exclude technology and politics is itself a sort of evangelicalism. I think some would say evangelicalism is as much a sociological category as it is a theological one, and it, in some sense, was a sort of concession to we're not a religion for the people who are ruling, because if you are,
that's right.
If you are, then you actually have immediate felt needs, or a concession to the idea that if you are in that position, Christianity shouldn't really have much to say about the sort of, it's not its job to intrude into that. So it was in many ways I think evangelicalism, and I would say it protected its orthodoxy. In some sense, there was a retreat from the public square that allowed it to protect its orthodoxy in a time when many of the churches that were more public also became far more corrupted. But I think that was a loss of something. Actually, I've said something nice about Keller. I think Keller's greatest virtue was he actually recovered a little bit of what had been abandoned when that the main line had, which is this recognition of engagement in the public square. I think he stopped too short of it at sort of an engagement that was a very neutral engagement rather than a assertion of the good. But I think it's sort of an interesting framing that man was made to rule. Genesis 1. We were given dominion. And I actually think that exercise of rule, of which, and we were made to create, right? What are the two things that were defined there is rule and creation. And that is, in some sense, sort of politics and technology are great expressions of that. So it's deep and fundamental to our human nature. I would also say that is actually a Protestant church that thrives. I think when the Protestant church focuses often, when its intellectuals focus on sort of the questions that Catholics like to talk about, certain types of philosophy, certain types of virtue, natural law. Those are sort of concepts that are big in the Catholic Church. I actually think we tend to lose those discussions. They tend to actually, in many sense, they send people to Rome because they have a deeper tradition there. I think Protestants are much stronger at understanding of things like commerce and even maybe a practical politics, right? America is a republican. It is a republic. And that idea of self-government is actually a very American, a very Protestant, even a very Presbyterian concept. And so I think that a church that actually confidently talks about the good of technology, the positive vision of technology. I think there's a tendency when the church talks about technology, it's most comfortable sort of talking about the danger, worrying about what it does to families or whatever. Silicon Valley was founded by, if not doctrinaire Protestants themselves, the sons of doctrinaire Protestants. The West Coast, in many ways, I think, embodies a ethic that, to the extent that it is Christianized, is going to be very Protestant, is going to really embrace that. It's going to be very compatible with that Protestant embrace of the good of secular vocation, which was really our distinctive. So to me, a Protestant church that can actually inspire people with a positive vision in the digital age is a church that is going to thrive, and it's a church that's going to answer the sort of void in the post-secular age that actually allows it to reclaim that mantle of leadership, of civilizational leadership, not even just local leadership.
Right. If you're at all familiar with New England, you know that every town green has a white clapboard church. And what that meant is that the very center of life was the church, not just in the sense that people gathered on Sunday to worship, but that the church had a leading role in the community at every level, political, educational, and so forth, commercial. And this is an idea that might strike you as very odd, but it wasn't uncommon for pastors to preach, say, a war sermon and actually gather the men of the congregation following the service and lead them off into battle. There are many accounts of that sort of thing. Today, when we think about Jonathan Edwards, for example, we think about sinners in the hands of an angry God or religious affections. Great and important things to remember him for, but we don't remember his war sermons. There's actually a book that was published by a friend of mine that contains the war sermons of Jonathan Edwards. So the town that my wife and I have our Connecticut house in is over 350 years old. And if you go to the town hall, there's a list of the war dead, and that goes all the way back to the French and Indian Wars, and that's the longest list. And it's because the battle was like literally 30 miles down the street. And this was the environment in which pastors were preaching and leading. They saw the relevance of the scriptures to every domain of life. It wasn't just narrowly focused on the internal state of a Christian soul. It was focused more broadly on everything that a Christian is involved with, which would include business, politics, that kind of stuff. Anyway, as we wrap up, anything you want to say as we conclude, Timon, and then Aaron?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I do always tell people to read New England sermons. I've read more than I should admit of these. Spent more time than I should admit on these things. For that reason, especially their political sermons. Look at this is what they're telling people all the time. It's what people believe. But I think you talking about the list of people who died in the French and Indian War. I mean, this is part of the angst of like the colonists is they've spilt their blood for the civilization they've carved out of rock. I mean, Jefferson constantly is talking about like the English government didn't help us at all. We did this. It's our country, right? This kind of Protestant ownership over the country, I think, is essential. That we've totally lost. Of this is ours, warts and all. So whatever the future is, it needs to be Protestant. It has to be us to figure it out. And a lot of going to the point about Catholics sort of directing discussions and even intellectual inquiry, a lot of like the 90s, as Catholics were sort of still negotiating their place in the story of America, led to strange conclusions or concessions by Protestants on how we define this thing, right? In some ways, an effort of ecumenism at the time that, decent reasons behind some of that politically. But the point is we completely lost this like Protestant predominance, not just, in the leadership, but even in our own sort of belief about what this is.
How many evangelicals are on the Supreme Court?
Yeah, 0.
How many Catholics?
6.
6.
6.
Yeah.
Did you even know that? Realize that? Why can't we produce the kinds of legal authorities that would be eligible for the Supreme Court?
I'm answering that question tomorrow.
Excellent. Tune in tomorrow. Anyway, anything you want to wrap up with, Aaron?
Yeah, just what I'd say is mentions of commerce is important. When I talk about leading, I don't want us to have this overly culture war, moral majority view that what leading means is we're going to ban abortion and we're going to do all these different specific moral things. It encompasses like making our country functional again in terms of income inequality, in terms of social cohesion, in terms of technology, in terms of our defense industrial base, in terms of building the next generations of technology. And I would say, this is where I might have a disagreement, is I don't think the church has all that much to do with that. I think it's lay Protestants who are operating in their secular vocations who make that happen. I do think we've become way too clericalist, ironically, in thinking about we want the pastor to be the all-person answer man. And my belief is like the pastor's job is to like preach the gospel and minister the sacraments. And, to the extent that the Bible says something about commerce, let's talk about that. But it really ought to be, it ought to be the businessman, the Christian Protestant businessman doing his thing more than that. And so I feel like we need to make sure we have an open aperture on what it means to lead. It's the full spectrum of domains in life, not just the moralistic domains.
It may surprise some of you here, but I don't think it would surprise you that I agree with you. And what is required a lot of the time is lay leadership who have not only the competence but also the confidence that what they're doing is pleasing to God. And that's one of the things that a pastor can help them understand, that their role in the world is something that serves the glory of God, but also is a way of loving your neighbor. So maybe something you want to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I mean, this is the most Protestant position in the world. The Reformation in a large part is about resacularizing the secular. It's actually the secular, sacred sort of this stark distinction is a medieval Catholic creation. They will accuse us of this now, of launching modernity. Charles Taylor and all this. This is a totally Catholic thing, and the Protestant like archetype is the industrious, layman. Who leads, right? In fact, leads the Reformation. In fact, reforms the church, right? This is sort of the Old Testament model and everything. So the Protestants have this sort of bent to them, or historically have, right? So if you're reforming society, it's generally speaking a layman doing that.
Well, that's a good note to end on. And I know we've got some fires going on outside, and there's no need for anybody to hightail it out of here. We've got a little time to enjoy each other's company and talk. Anything we want to do or have people know before we kind of let them go for that?
Yeah. Let's thank our speakers.